Welcome to tonight's journey. Before we begin, let me know where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Perhaps you are in Madrid, as the city lights outside have softened after a long day. Perhaps you are in Barcelona, where the night breeze from the Mediterranean drifts quietly past the windows. Or perhaps you are in Valencia, Seville, Bilbao, Malaga, Zaragoza, or a peaceful little town somewhere in Spain, where the room has grown dark and every sound has begun to fade into the distance. Wherever you are, let your shoulders relax for a moment. Let your breathing slow down, and allow the sound of this story to carry you to the edge of a cold, wide river, flowing quietly toward the Irish Sea. Tonight, we will travel through the entire history of Liverpool, not in haste, not with noise, but like a slow walk along the banks of the River Mersey. Before this place became a city of music, football, docks, warehouses, ocean-going ships, and memories that refuse to fade, Liverpool was once only a small piece of land beside the water. There was mud, there was sea wind, there were wooden boats, there were people watching the tides rise and fall, without knowing that the place where they lived would one day become one of the great gateways of the world. We will begin in the distant past, when Liverpool had not yet taken the shape of a great port city. Then, step by step, we will move through the Middle Ages, the rise of the old dock, the ships of the Atlantic, the light and shadow of the British Empire, the streams of migrants leaving their homelands, the nights of bombing during the war, the sound of the Beatles' guitars, the roar from the football terraces, and finally, a modern Liverpool still standing beside the Mersey, reborn, and still remembering. So settle down comfortably. Let the city by the river open slowly before your eyes. And now, we begin. Before Liverpool became a name that echoed with music, football, red brick docks, and ships crossing the oceans, this place was once only a quiet stretch of land beside the water. If you can close your eyes for a moment, imagine yourself standing on the northern bank of the Mersey estuary, around the late 12th or early 13th century. Before Liverpool was officially recognized as a town by King John in 1207. At that time, Liverpool was not yet a city. It was not yet a great seaport. It was only a small waterside settlement, part of the wider area of West Derby, lying among low ground, mud flats, the river, and rough paths leading down to the water's edge. The morning in that place was probably cold and damp. There were no great buildings looking down over the river, no ship horns, no crowded streets, no lights stretching along the docks. Before you, there was only a wide, gray river, slowly changing color with the sky. When the tide rose, water spilled into the lowlands, slipped through the marshes, and wrapped itself around the soft, muddy banks. When the tide withdrew, the ground emerged dark and heavy with moisture, marked by the footprints of seabirds and the dragged lines of small boats. Wind from the Irish Sea blew inland, carrying the scent of salt, seaweed, mud, wood smoke, and the distant feeling of an outside world. That land, at the time, did not have the appearance of an urban place, seen through modern eyes. We might imagine it more like a riverside village, a small anchoring point, a scattered cluster of homes rather than a city. The houses were low and simple, made from materials close to medieval life: timber, packed earth, thatch, rough stone. The paths were not neatly paved like the streets that would come later. They may have been soft dirt tracks, muddy after rain, harder on windy days. Around them were fields, small plots of farmland, fences, animal pens, open ground, and water that changed constantly with the tide. Before the name Liverpool entered the map as an important seaport, this land belonged to a smaller, slower world, one closer to seasons and tides. The communities living around it did not think they were standing at the center of a historical story. They simply lived from day to day, like so many people in other waterside places. Some fished on the river. Some cared for animals on patches of land high and dry enough to use. Some cultivated small fields. Some watched the water to know when to push a boat out, when to pull it back, and when the wind was about to change. Time was not measured by clocks then, but by light, by rain, by seasons, by the tide, by birds calling along the bank, and by the shifting direction of the wind. Imagine an afternoon in that place, long before Liverpool became a famous port city, along the shore. A few low roofs sit scattered across the land, separated by damp earth, wild grass, and narrow footpaths. Thin smoke rises from hearth fires inside the homes and fades into the gray sky. A child runs across the soft ground, leaving shallow footprints in the mud. A man pulls a small boat a little higher up the bank, knowing the water will rise tonight. A woman stands in the doorway, looking toward the river, waiting for someone to return before darkness settles. Farther away, a few animals lower their heads to graze in the cold wind. A seabird glides low over the water, then disappears into the thin mist drifting in from the estuary. If a traveler had passed through this place at that time, they would probably not have seen anything magnificent. They would not have seen a great city. They would not have heard the loud noise of commerce. They would have seen only a small community clinging to the edge of the water, living between land and river, between the steadiness of fields and the distant invitation of the sea. But in the history of Liverpool, that very smallness was the true beginning. Before there were docks, before there were trains, before there were songs and stadiums, Liverpool was once a place like this: low, damp, quiet, humble, and silently waiting beside the River Mersey. In the Middle Ages, England was not a peaceful and unified land in the way we might easily imagine today. Power was divided into many layers, from the king, nobles, lords, and the church to local communities. For a place to develop into a trading town, it usually needed more than people and land. It needed rights, it needed privileges, it needed recognition, it needed some form of official permission so that people could trade, hold markets, own land under certain conditions, and gradually attract new residents. For Liverpool, the first important moment came in 1207, under the reign of King John of England. On August 28, 1207, King John issued a document known as Letters Patent, granting Liverpool the status of a free borough, a self-governing town with certain legal rights and privileges. This was not the moment when the town suddenly appeared out of nothing. People had lived here before. There had already been small paths, riverside activity, and links with the surrounding land. But that document was like an official marker, a thin yet important line drawn across the timeline. From this point on, Liverpool was no longer only a place where people lived beside the water. It began to take shape as a town with a commercial future, an anchoring point on the map of power and exchange within the kingdom. King John's reason was not a romantic dream of a city. Medieval kings often looked at land with practical eyes. Liverpool had a useful position for movement across the Irish Sea, especially in a period when England was concerned with campaigns and influence in Ireland. A small harbor on the Mersey could become a place for gathering people, goods, ships, taxes, and control. For that reason, Liverpool's official birth was tied clearly to political and commercial needs. But history often has a strange quality. A practical decision made by power can sometimes open the way to a story far greater than the person who gave the order could ever have imagined. If we looked at Liverpool at that moment, we would not see the shape of a great city. There were no broad avenues, no vast docks, no warehouses stretching along the water, no crowds of migrants lining up to board ships. What we might see was only a small town beginning to grow into its new role, a place with a few roads, a few divided plots of land, some exchange, a handful of boats, and a few families arriving with the hope of better opportunity. Yet within that humility, there was already a quiet movement, from a waterside community into a town that had been named, recognized, and allowed to grow. Those early days can be imagined like a painting blurred by mist. In the morning, footsteps pass over damp ground. Small traders bring goods to market. Fish are laid in baskets, hides, wool, grain, salt, and everyday objects are exchanged in low, close, unhurried voices. Small boats wait for the right water before leaving the shore. No one thinks they are living at the beginning of Liverpool in some grand historical sense. For them, it is simply life. But for us, looking back from many centuries later, each ordinary detail becomes precious because it shows us that a city is not born from legend, but from deeply human acts, building homes, opening markets, keeping boats, traveling, trading, waiting, and hoping. The River Mersey at that time was both a boundary and a road to those who lived beside it. Water was not merely scenery. Water determined the rhythm of life. It could provide fish, passage, and the possibility of trade. But it could also bring danger, soften the land into mud, sweep things away, and separate people. A town that wished to live beside water had to learn how to read it. People had to know which banks were safe, when to move, where a boat could be moored, and which weather should be avoided, perhaps from very early on. The people of Liverpool carried within them the habit of watching the water, the patience of communities living with the tide. The city would later become great, but its deepest rhythm still began with this simple act, looking at the river and waiting for the right moment. In its first centuries, Liverpool remained small compared with many other towns and cities in England. Places such as London, York, Bristol, and Chester had older histories, clearer roles, larger populations, and stronger networks of power. Liverpool was different. It was like a small point of light in the northwest, not yet important enough to draw much attention. But sometimes, in history, smallness does not mean meaninglessness. A place outside the center can have the freedom to slowly gather its own identity. A town that is not too large can learn to adapt to its own landscape. And a humble harbor can wait until the commercial currents of the world begin to change direction. What matters is that we should not look at Liverpool during this period too hastily through the eyes of the future. We know that later. The city would be associated with great docks, the Atlantic, empire, music, and football. But the people living in its earliest centuries did not know that. They could not see the enormous warehouses that would one day rise. They could not hear in advance the sound of guitars echoing from cellar clubs many centuries later. They could not imagine stadiums filled with song. They saw only what was close to them: a riverbank, a plot of land, a muddy path, a market day, a cold winter, a short summer, a boat journey to Ireland, a roof that needed repair before the rain arrived. Alongside official history, Liverpool also gradually began to nurture symbols of its own. One of the most famous images later associated with the city is the liver bird, the mythical creature long connected with Liverpool. But in this early period, we should understand it as a symbolic layer. A way later, generations looked back and told the story of Liverpool's identity, not as a historical event in the ordinary sense. Old cities often need symbols in order to recognize themselves. Some have lions, some have dragons, some have bell towers, some have bridges. Liverpool has the image of a mysterious bird looking out over the river, as if it has always been watching between land and sea, between what has passed and what has not yet come. If we return to the banks of the Mersey at the end of a medieval day, the scene would probably still be humble. The sun sinks low behind gray clouds. Pale streaks of light slide across the water. People pull doors shut, light fires, and bring their belongings inside. The cold wind makes the thatched roofs tremble softly. Outside, the river continues moving in the darkness, neither hurried nor still. It had flowed before people gave this place a name, and it would continue flowing long after each generation had passed away. To a person living there, the Mersey was simply part of daily life. But to the future city, it was the spine, the first memory, the reason Liverpool could become Liverpool. For that reason, the year 1207 should not be told like a thunderclap, but like the first soft knock on the door of history. From a royal document, a town was recognized. From a small town, a possibility opened. But that possibility did not become reality at once. Liverpool would still have to pass through many slow centuries, many rainy seasons, many market days, many boat journeys, many rising and falling tides before it entered larger stages of its story. At this moment, what mattered most was not greatness, but direction. Liverpool had taken its place beside the water, and from there, it began to look outward. Perhaps if a traveler had passed through Liverpool in those days, they would not have thought they had seen anything special. They might have remembered only the mud underfoot, the wind from the river, a few boats, a few roofs, a small town still thinly settled. They would have continued on their way, not knowing that one day this place would become a name tied to millions of lives. But history does not always announce itself through brightness. Sometimes, what is about to become important begins in the most ordinary form, almost unnoticed. A stretch of low ground, a waterway, an administrative decision, a small community, a river. And that is the quiet beauty of Liverpool's beginning. It reminds us that cities are like people before they have their own voice. They have a childhood. Before the world knows them, they have silent years. Before they become symbols, they were once places where someone lit a fire through the night, mended a net, pulled a boat ashore, watched the sky for rain, and hoped tomorrow would be calm enough to keep living. Liverpool, in this first chapter, was not yet a city of glory. It was a city in the shape of a seedling, still low, still damp, still rough, but already rooted in the very place where history would slowly find it. When night falls on the banks of the Mersey, we can imagine that small town sinking into darkness. There is no electric light, no engine noise, only the soft sound of water against the shore, the wind moving through low grass, the small crackle of fire inside simple homes, farther out, beyond the estuary. The Irish Sea opens into the night, vast and not yet fully known. The first people of Liverpool probably did not think much about that distant world, but living beside it changed them. Little by little, they learned to turn their eyes toward the water. They learned to wait for boats. They learned to believe that beyond the horizon there might be another chance. And so, Liverpool entered history not with the roar of a crowd, but with the slow breathing of a riverside land, a place made from mud, water, wind, the authority of a king, and the patience of ordinary people. The first chapter closes here, while Liverpool is still small, still quiet, still standing at the edge of the water like a promise not yet fully opened. But the promise has been placed there. The name has been spoken. The town has been recognized, and the river Mersey, silent beneath the night sky, continues flowing toward the sea. After the name Liverpool was spoken in King John's document in 1207, the small town beside the river Mersey did not immediately become a great seaport. There was no magical morning when massive docks suddenly appeared, when the streets suddenly filled with merchants, or when ocean-going ships arrived and covered the surface of the water. Liverpool's history in the first centuries after that moment unfolded much more slowly. It was like a child that had just been given a name, just been given a place on the map, but still needed many years to learn how to stand, how to walk, and finally, how to look toward the sea. If we stood in Liverpool in the 13th century, after this place had become a borough, we would still see a very modest scene. A few small roads ran from the higher ground down toward the edge of the water. Low houses stood closer together than before, but still did not create the crowded feeling of a large urban place. In some areas, the ground was still soft and muddy, especially after cold rains blew in from the west. The air carried the smell of hearth smoke, livestock, wet grass, and the faint saltiness drifting in from the estuary. Liverpool at that time was not yet a city in the modern sense. It was a small waterside town, a place that still had an agricultural life, while also beginning to carry within itself the habits of a port. What changed was not immediately visible on the surface, but in the direction of movement. Before, the people here had lived with the river as a familiar part of the landscape. After 1207, the river began to take on another meaning. It was no longer only a place for fishing, a place to moor small boats, a place where the tide rose and fell with the seasons. Gradually, it became a road with no paving stones, no milestones, no fences, but one that could carry people and goods farther than the dirt paths of the village. From the banks of the Mersey, Liverpool's gaze began to turn more often toward the Irish Sea, toward crossings to and from Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the lands beyond the grey water. Life in a small, medieval port town was not like the bustling image we often imagine when speaking of seaports. There were no long lines of great ships, no engines, no cranes, no tall red brick warehouses like those that would appear in later centuries. Port activity at that time could be very simple: a few small wooden boats, a few natural landing places, a few people unloading goods by hand, a few animals pulling loads through muddy ground, a few merchants exchanging news in the cold wind. The goods were not always exotic or precious. They might have been fish, salt, hides, wool, grain, livestock, wine, rough cloth, and the ordinary objects of a world still living close to the land, to handcraft, and to the seasons. But those ordinary things were precisely the first foundation of a commercial habit. A town learns to become a port not by seeing the world all at once, but by repeating small actions again and again. A boat arrives. A piece of goods is weighed. A payment is made. A piece of news from Ireland is retold beside the hearth. A new family comes to settle because they have heard that trade might be possible here. A young person begins to grow used to looking not only toward the fields, but also toward the water, season by season, exchange by exchange, short voyage by short voyage. Liverpool learned to understand that the Mersey did not end in front of it. That water connected it to a wider world. We can imagine a morning in this town near the end of the 13th century. Mist still lies low over the river. The roofs are damp from the cold night. A man opens his door and looks up at the sky to read the weather. Near the water's edge, a few people are preparing a boat. They are not traveling as far as the ocean-crossing ships of later centuries. But for a small community, a crossing over the Irish Sea was already a significant journey. The tide had to be calculated. The wind had to be heard. The weight of the goods had to be arranged correctly. A small mistake on the water could turn an ordinary trip into a disaster. And so, Liverpool's courage in those days was not loud. It lay in the willingness to leave the shore, while always understanding that the sea never fully belonged to human beings. During those centuries, Liverpool still lived in the shadow of larger centers, in the northwest of England. Chester had long held a more important position, with an older history and a stronger commercial role, compared with Chester. Liverpool was like a younger sibling, still learning how to enter regional life. But history does not stand still. Rivers, ports, and trade routes change over time. Some places that once prospered later struggled because of silt, shifting currents, politics, or changing commerce. Some places began small, but gradually found their opportunity through position and persistence. Liverpool had not yet risen above others in this period, but it was quietly learning an important lesson. Cities by the water must know how to wait. That waiting was not passive. People still built houses, repaired boats, opened markets, traded, prayed, had children, buried their dead, and lived through seasons of hunger and rain. The town may have been small, but the life within it was not simple. A day might begin with a rooster's call, the opening of wooden doors, footsteps over damp earth. Then slowly, the sound of the market would rise. People brought goods, asked prices, bargained, told stories of distant roads. Someone from across the water might bring news of war, taxes, failed harvests, or opportunities for trade in another place. In those days, news did not travel through screens or daily newspapers. It came by word of mouth, by boat, by the steps of travelers, and because of that, every piece of news felt as though it had truly crossed a distance to arrive here. In a town like Liverpool, the market and the waterfront gradually became two parallel hearts. The market kept life on land moving. The waterfront kept the imagination open to the outside. A person might trade in the market in the morning, then walk down to watch a boat leave the shore in the afternoon. A child might grow up between the sounds of animals in the fields and the calls of people by the riverbank. That child might hear parents speak of planting seasons, then hear sailors speak of winds, reefs, other harbors, strangers, and unfamiliar goods. Slowly, in the minds of those generations, Liverpool was no longer a place that faced only the land. It began to have two directions, one toward the fields and villages around it, and one toward the water, opening out to the greater sea. This is what created the subtle difference of medieval Liverpool. It was not wealthy as it would later become, not crowded as it would later become, not famous as it would later become, but it began to form a very particular urban instinct, the instinct of an in-between place. Liverpool was not entirely rural, but it was not yet truly a great city. It did not belong wholly to the land, nor wholly to the sea. It stood between field and water, between England and Ireland, between the safety of the shore and the invitation of the horizon. Places that stand between worlds often have complicated histories, because they must learn to listen to many directions at once. If morning in Liverpool was the time of work, then evening was perhaps the time of stories. When the wind grew colder and the light withdrew from the river, people returned indoors, closed their doors, and lit their fires. Outside, the water continued to rise and fall in the darkness, in the small glow of firelight. There may have been stories of journeys to Ireland, of a sudden storm, of a boat that returned late, of a merchant carrying something never seen before, of a stranger speaking in a different accent. Those stories did not need to be grand, but they nourished the feeling that the world did not stop at the riverbank. And for a small town, that feeling was already a profound change. Even so, life in Liverpool during this period was full of limits. A poor harvest could make the whole community anxious. A disease could make streets that were already quiet become even more silent. A political disturbance from far away could bring taxes, soldiers, or new commands. A storm could damage boats, destroy goods, or take lives. A port did not only bring opportunity, it also brought risk. Each time a boat left the shore, those who remained had to wait. And that waiting was perhaps a deep part of the soul of every community living beside the sea, waiting for the wind to change, waiting for the tide to rise, waiting for someone to return, waiting for news from far away, waiting for a better season. In this picture, the River Mersey was always present as the quietest yet most important character. It did not speak, but it decided so much. The river gave Liverpool its place, but it also forced the town to remain humble. Every day, the tide reminded human beings that they could not control everything, every season. The sea wind reminded them that the world was wide and unpredictable. Every boat journey reminded them that life might open if one dared to step away from shore, but that the price of that step was never entirely light. And so, Liverpool did not learn to look toward the sea through early pride. It learned through experience, through caution, through small failures, through the calloused hands of people pulling boats and the eyes of those used to reading the sky before saying whether tomorrow could be traveled or not. Across many centuries, the town still did not explode into greatness. It remained small when compared with more powerful places. But within that slowness, a coastal culture was being gathered. People grew more accustomed to strangers, more accustomed to goods arriving and leaving, more accustomed to news from elsewhere changing the mood of the market, more accustomed to the feeling that a decision made on the water could affect the food on the table. Those habits did not create glory immediately, but they created possibility. And the history of Liverpool is the history of a possibility nurtured for a very long time before it truly expanded. There may have been days when the town seemed almost motionless in the rain. Dirt roads softened, wheels sank, and walkers pulled their coats tighter around themselves. The low roofs disappeared into grayness. The river looked like a sheet of cold metal, unfriendly and uninviting. But then there were other mornings when the wind was gentler, the light thinner, and the water opened quietly. A boat was pushed down. A person stepped aboard, placing a hand on the damp wooden side. Those who stayed behind watched. There was no applause, no grand ceremony, only a small departure from the shore, repeated across many generations. Yet those small departures taught Liverpool something the city would never forget: to survive here. One had to know how to live with the water. What matters is that Liverpool did not look toward the ocean from the beginning with faraway dreams of the wider world. It looked toward the sea first because of the needs of survival, because it needed exchange, because it needed ties with Ireland, because it needed to find opportunity beyond the limits of the land around it. Port cities often begin that way, not with the ambition of conquest, but with the practical tasks of life. But over time, practicality can open the way for imagination. A child growing up in Liverpool might hear enough stories to begin wondering what lay beyond the sea. A small trader might make one journey and then wish to make another. A family might realize that their life was not tied only to the patch of land behind their home, but also to the water before them. And so, through the Middle Ages, Liverpool gradually became a town that knew how to face outward, not quickly, not brilliantly, not with certainty, but clearly from a named settlement. It became a community with a rhythm of trade, from a familiar riverbank. It became a point of connection with the Irish Sea, from a small place in the shadow of greater centers. It quietly kept hold of its advantage, its position beside the River Mersey, where water could carry people farther than the land allowed. As we come to the end of this part of the journey, imagine Liverpool on some late medieval evening. The town has grown quiet. The market is empty. Wooden doors are closed. Firelight inside the houses glimmers only faintly through the cracks, down by the riverbank. A few boats lie tilted in the darkness, waiting for tomorrow's tide. Far away, the Irish Sea cannot be clearly seen, but it can be felt in the wind. Liverpool is still small, still humble, still not the great port city the world would later come to know. But it has changed in one very important way. It no longer stands beside the river simply to live from day to day. It has begun to look along the water, through the estuary, toward the sea. And once a town has learned to look toward the sea, it can never completely return to what it was before. Not a dock in the simple sense of a few boats moored by the water's edge. Not a stretch of riverbank where people pulled cargo ashore when the tide was favorable. But a structure built to hold the water back, to tame part of the unstable breathing of the River Mersey, to turn waiting into commerce, and to transform a riverside town into a machine slowly opening itself toward the Atlantic. Before the old dock came into being, Liverpool still had to live according to the temper of the tides. The water on the River Mersey could rise very high, withdraw very far, and leave behind wide stretches of mud, slick, heavy, and unpredictable. For the small boats of earlier times, this had been a familiar part of life, but as trade grew, as goods became more plentiful, as ships needed to come and go more regularly, relying too heavily on the tide became a limitation. People could not always wait. Cargo could not remain forever on the shore. Ships could not always expose themselves to the risks of mud, shallow bottoms, and weather. Imagine Liverpool in the early 1700s. The town was no longer the silent cluster of small houses from its earliest centuries. It had become more crowded, with more traders, more voices calling to one another down by the water. But it still did not yet have the appearance of the enormous port city it would later become. The streets were still narrow, houses pressed close to the shore. The smell of the river, fish, wet timber, coal smoke, and cargo blended together in the air. In the morning, while mist still covered the surface of the Mersey, one could already hear hurried footsteps, wheels grinding over uneven ground, ropes pulled tight, wooden barrels knocking against one another, people calling out prices, ship names, and asking for other hands to come and help. But beneath that bustle was a very practical problem. Water did not stand still according to human wishes. The tide came and went. When the water was low, a ship could run aground. When the weather was bad, unloading became dangerous. When goods had to wait too long, money was also held back. A seaport that wanted to grow needed more than a good location. It needed the ability to operate. It needed a rhythm more stable than nature. And in Liverpool, that bold idea gradually took shape. If human beings could not command the tide, They could build a place to hold the water in. The old dock opened in 1715, and for Liverpool, it was a profound turning point. This structure was built on the site of what had once been a natural tidal inlet, where the water cut deep into the land, instead of letting the tide flow freely in and out as before. People created an enclosed dock with quay walls, gates, and the ability to keep ships afloat in a more stable body of water. The idea may sound simple when seen from the present, but at that moment, it was a major transformation. It changed Liverpool from a place that waited for the tide into a place that knew how to hold the tide back in service of trade. That image is worth pausing over for a moment. A body of water enclosed by stone, timber, engineering, and labor. Workers digging, building, measuring, pulling, constructing, struggling against mud and cold water, hands stained with earth, heavy boots clinging to the mud, the sound of hammers ringing in the damp wind. Each quay wall took shape not as decoration, but as a quiet declaration. Liverpool no longer simply lived beside the River Mersey. Liverpool began to organize the water, measure it, use it, and through that, expand its own power. When the old dock began operating, the rhythm of the town changed. Ships could remain in the dock more safely. Goods could be loaded and unloaded more conveniently. Merchants had more reason to trust Liverpool. Laborers had more work. The streets near the dock grew busier. Taverns, lodging houses, warehouses, commercial offices, repair workshops, weighing places, record-keeping rooms, all gradually gathered around that controlled body of water. A dock is not only a place where ships stop, it draws the entire city closer to itself. On a morning in the years after the old dock opened, we can imagine the water inside the dock lying calmer than the river outside. Beyond it, the Mersey still rose and fell, wide, gray, and unpredictable, but inside, ships rested closer together, their masts reflected on the water. Planks were laid across the gaps, and porters moved over them. Backs bent beneath the weight of wooden barrels. Some goods came from Ireland. Some were bound for other parts of England. And increasingly, there were goods connected to a vast trading system stretching across the Atlantic. Here, the story of Liverpool begins to change color. At first, we may hear the sound of success, a small town growing larger, a new dock helping trade expand, streets becoming more crowded, money flowing in, houses being built, new ambitions taking shape. But if we listen more closely, beneath the sound of wheels and waves striking the quay walls, there is another sound, lower and heavier. It is the sound of a commercial world built not only on goods, engineering, and boldness, but also on coercion, exploitation, and the suffering of human beings turned into property. In the 18th century, Liverpool became increasingly entangled in the transatlantic slave trade. The ships from this city did not only carry sugar, tobacco, rum, cotton, industrial goods, or colonial products. They also belonged to a brutal system in which Africans were captured, bought and sold, carried across the ocean in horrifying conditions, and then forced to labor on plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. In the commercial records of the time, they were often written down as cargo. But in this story, we must remember very clearly they were human beings. They had names, families, memories, languages, childhoods, homelands, fears, hopes, and all of it was torn away from their lives. This is a part of history that cannot be told in a simple voice of pride. The old dock helped Liverpool grow wealthy. Atlantic trade helped the city expand. Merchants, ship owners, investors, and many related trades benefited from that network. But this wealth cast a very long shadow. It passed through seaports in West Africa, through cramped ship holds, through separations without farewell, through chained bodies, through lives seized by force. If Liverpool became a city facing the world, then part of that path was paved with the suffering of people who never chose to step onto it. Imagine a ship leaving Liverpool in the 18th century. On deck, sailors check the rigging, owners inspect documents. The wind blows from the Mersey toward the sea. The city gradually falls back behind them, its roofs and masts shrinking into the mist. For some people on shore, this might have looked like an image of opportunity, profit, expansion, and adventure. But at another stage of the journey, that same ship would become part of a far, darker network. It would connect Liverpool to the coast of Africa, then to plantations across the Atlantic, where people were forced to work in order to produce goods that would return to European markets. That commerce is often called the triangular trade. Goods from Europe went to Africa. Africans were captured and carried across the Atlantic, and products created by forced labor returned to Europe. But that phrase sounds too neat, too geometric, too clean compared with the reality. A triangle on a map cannot contain all the crying in the hold of a ship. A trade arrow cannot express all the families that were broken apart. A number cannot replace a human life. And so, when telling the story of Liverpool in this period, we must hold two images at once: a city growing wealthy beside the River Mersey, and an ocean where that wealth was tied to losses beyond measure. On the streets of Liverpool, prosperity began to leave its traces. Money from trade helped build houses, expand facilities, and support related industries: shipbuilders, rope makers, insurance sellers, record keepers, porters, suppliers of food for ships, barrel repairers. All were drawn into the turning rhythm of the port. The city did not grow rich through a few isolated merchants alone. It grew rich as a network, and within that network, profits from slavery seeped into many layers of urban life, sometimes clearly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes hidden beneath the ordinary appearance of ledgers, contracts, and shipments. At the end of the day, when the light softened over the dock, the old dock could look very beautiful. The water inside reflected the masts. Barrels were stacked in rows. Tired laborers returned through the damp streets. Voices faded in the alleys. A few windows lit up. Outside, the River Mersey continued flowing toward the sea, carrying new ships away and bringing older ships back home. If we looked only with our eyes, we might see a city growing, a seaport succeeding, an engineering work proving its value. But history does not allow us to look only with our eyes. It forces us to ask, who paid the price for that success? That question does not diminish the importance of the old dock. On the contrary, it makes the story more truthful. This dock changed Liverpool. It helped the city enter a new stage of development. It showed how human beings could turn landscape into opportunity, water into infrastructure, a riverside town into a rising port. But precisely because the old dock was so important, we must look clearly at the world it served. A structure can be an engineering achievement and, at the same time, part of a deeply shadowed moral system. History is rarely clean. It is often made from opposing realities existing in the same space. Liverpool in the 18th century therefore became a place of two heartbeats. One was the heartbeat of success: ships coming in, ships going out, goods loaded, goods unloaded, money circulating, population rising, ambitions expanding. The other was a heavier heartbeat: slave ships, chained bodies, people torn from their homelands, products returning to Europe carrying the traces of forced labor. These two rhythms were not separate. They existed in the same period, passed through the same port, and left their marks on the formation of the city. Perhaps on some night, when the wind moved through the streets near the dock, an ordinary Liverpool resident might have heard only the sound of sail ropes tapping lightly against masts, water striking the stone, and late footsteps returning home. Life continued. Children slept. Hearth fires burned. Workers prepared for tomorrow, but far away, beyond the sight of the town. Sea routes connected Liverpool to an enormous system that was still operating. And every day, that system made the city wealthier, while also forcing its future to carry a memory that could not easily be washed away. What is worth reflecting on is that the people who built the old dock probably could not see the full meaning of that structure across the centuries to come. For them, it was a solution to a very specific problem: how to make ships and goods work more effectively in a river with difficult tides. But history often begins with practical solutions like that. A dock opens, and trade increases. Trade increases, and the city changes. The city changes. And the moral choices of an age attach themselves to bricks, streets, families, names, and memory. No structure is entirely innocent if it serves a world that is not innocent. When we look back at Liverpool during this period, we must avoid two overly simple ways of telling the story. We should not only praise the city as a miracle of commerce, because doing so would ignore the people buried beneath the profits, but we should also not tell the story as if Liverpool were only darkness, because the city was a place of many layers of life: poor laborers, sailors, women, children, craftsmen, migrants, small traders, people who did not hold power but were still drawn into the machinery of the port. A city is never only the sin of its wealthy class, nor only the beauty of its buildings. It is a complex body, where many fates live beneath the same sky. And the old dock lay at the center of that body like a new heart. Each ship entering the dock was a heartbeat. Each barrel pulled ashore was a heartbeat. Each profit recorded in a ledger was a heartbeat. But each name erased from a homeland. Each person turned into merchandise on the Atlantic journey was also another heartbeat, deeper and more painful, even if many people in the city at the time did not want to hear it, or did not have the courage to hear it. The history of Liverpool in the 18th century is precisely the history of such overlapping heartbeats. By the end of the 18th century, Liverpool was no longer the small town that had slowly learned to face the sea in earlier centuries. It had become a major port stretching powerfully toward the Atlantic. Ships, merchants, warehouses, and trade relationships had changed the city faster than ever before. But the farther Liverpool went, the more shadows it carried with it. The River Mersey still flowed, still cold, still wide, still reflecting the gray skies of northwest England. But now, on that water, we do not see only the image of opportunity. We also see the shadow of the ships that connected the city to one of the most painful chapters in human history. And so, when night falls over the docks of 18th century Liverpool, let us imagine that scene with both tenderness and awareness. The water inside the old dock is calmer than the river outside. The masts stand black against the pale sky. One last porter leaves the quay, shoulders aching, hands cold. A warehouse door closes in a nearby house. A small candle burns on the table. The city seems to be resting after a long day, but the history inside it has never truly slept. The old dock changed Liverpool. It helped a riverside town enter a larger, wealthier, more ambitious age of commerce. But alongside that wealth came a darkness that cannot be separated from the story. And from here, Liverpool would continue to grow. No longer only a place that looked toward the sea, but a port city being drawn into the strongest currents of the Atlantic world. The currents of goods, money, empire, people, suffering, and memory. After 1807, when Britain officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade, Liverpool's story did not turn to an entirely clean page, nor did it stop beside the old walls of the old dock. The city continued to grow. Ships still moved in and out of the River Mersey. Warehouses remained full of goods. Merchants still recorded, calculated, invested, and expanded. But now, Liverpool was stepping deeper into a new century, the century of steam engines, railways, industry, migration, and the British Empire spread wide across the map of the world. It was the 19th century, and Liverpool was no longer the riverside town slowly learning how to face the sea. It had become a great doorway, a doorway opening from England onto the Atlantic, a place where goods came in, went out, changed hands, changed form, changed fate. Along the banks of the Mersey, the wind was still cold, the water still gray, the tide still rose and fell as it had for generations. But around that water, everything had grown faster. There were more wheels, more hammers, more foreign voices, whistles, chains, cargo, horse-drawn carts, and the footsteps of people crowding the streets near the docks all created a new breath for the city, thicker, stronger, but also more exhausted. Liverpool, after the age of the slave trade, did not escape empire. On the contrary, it became an even more important part of that machinery. The British Empire was not only flags planted in distant places, not only maps colored red in classrooms, not only stories of warships and colonies. For Liverpool, empire appeared in very concrete things: cotton, sugar, tobacco, tea, timber, spices, grain, metal, wool, cloth, machinery, marine insurance, banks, warehouses, sailors, and shipping papers signed by candlelight. Empire was not an abstract idea. It lay in every barrel rolled across the quay, every bale of cotton placed inside a warehouse, every ship resting beneath the cold mist of the Mersey. Among those goods, cotton held a special role. Across Lancashire, Manchester and the surrounding industrial towns were turning into enormous centers of textile production. The factories needed raw materials. They needed cotton, coal, machinery, and a road to the sea. Liverpool had what Manchester needed, a great port facing the world. Manchester had what Liverpool needed, industrial power. Factories capable of turning raw materials into goods to be sold everywhere, between the two cities. A relationship almost like a bloodstream gradually formed. Liverpool breathed through the sea. Manchester breathed through machines, and between sea and machine. People needed a road faster than all the old roads. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, and with it, a truly new age began. Before that, goods could travel by canal, by horse-drawn cart, by slower means that depended heavily on weather, roads, and pulling strength. But the steam railway brought a completely different feeling. It was not only a form of transport, it was speed laid upon iron rails. It was the sound of the industrial age echoing across fields, villages, and lands once accustomed to a much slower rhythm of life. Imagine the first morning when a steam train moved between Liverpool and Manchester. Black smoke curled into the sky. Iron wheels ground against the rails. The ground trembled lightly beneath the feet of those watching. Some were astonished. Some were anxious. Some could not believe that such a machine would change their lives so deeply. But from that moment on, Liverpool was no longer connected to the world only by water. The city began to connect with the interior by the speed of steam. Goods from the port could reach industrial centers more quickly. Products from factories could reach the port more quickly. Time was shortened, distance was compressed, and Liverpool became the crossing point between the two greatest movements of the century, sea ships and railways. That change did not exist only on the map of trade. It changed the feeling of the city. People could hear the railway as a new sound in daily life. The whistle of the train echoed through the mist. Wheels carried goods from Manchester toward the Mersey, bales of cloth, bales of cotton, crates of machinery, and containers of goods were moved from the railway down to the waterfront. A port city that had already been busy now became even more like a gigantic body, where each route was a vein, each warehouse a lung, each dock a secondary heart beating without rest through rain and sun alike. But as Liverpool grew, the old structures were no longer enough. The old dock had been the revolution of 1715, but the 19th century needed spaces that were larger, safer, and stronger. There were more goods, larger ships, greater ambitions. The city did not only need a waterfront, it needed a dock system that could speak the language of industry, brick, stone, iron, warehouses, cranes, safety, speed, control, and within that context, Albert Dock appeared as a new symbol of Liverpool. Albert Dock officially opened in 1846. If the old dock had been the first doorway that led Liverpool into the modern age of ports, then Albert Dock was like a larger, more confident, more certain declaration. It was not built merely to be beautiful. It was built to work. Its blocks of red brick, stone, and iron warehouses stood close to the water, forming an enclosed and solid space, almost without timber in the main structure, in order to reduce the risk of fire. Something extremely important in a world filled with flammable cargo. Thick walls, orderly windows, iron columns, and the water inside the dock created a scene that was both practical and solemn, as if commerce had built itself a temple from industrial materials. In its early days of operation, Albert Dock must have been full of sound, goods being unloaded from ships, chains rolling through pulleys, porters calling to one another in the wind, horses' hooves on the road, water gently striking the dock walls. In the air were the scents of damp wood, rope, smoke, and goods from distant lands, sugar, tea, cotton, tobacco, spices, wine, leather, seeds, and metal. Each smell was like a small fragment of the world brought home and placed beneath the sky of Liverpool. A person passing through the dock did not need to look at a map to feel that this city had touched more places than the eyes could see. But, as in the previous chapter, the greatness of trade must always be seen with both eyes. One eye looking at engineering, labor, organization, and human creativity. The other eye looking at injustice, colonial systems, and sources of goods created by cheap or forced labor in distant lands. Although the slave trade had been abolished in Britain, many streams of 19th century commerce were still tied to the imperial world, and in many periods. Cotton imported into Liverpool was still connected with slavery in the American South before the American Civil War. So, when we look at white cotton bales piled inside a warehouse, we do not only see raw material for factories, we must also see distant fields, hands laboring under the sun, and lives placed inside the machinery of a global economy that was never truly fair. Liverpool in the 19th century was therefore both a city of progress and a city of difficult questions. The railway astonished people. Albert Dock made them proud. Ships carrying goods far away made the city wealthier. But that wealth was not separate from the wider network of power known as the British Empire. On the dockside, everything seemed very concrete: a barrel, an invoice, a crane, a warehouse. But behind them was an entire world system, where a decision made in Liverpool could touch a laborer in the Caribbean, a cotton grower in America, a tea trader in Asia, a textile worker in Manchester, and a buyer in another European city. That is why Liverpool during this period was not only a place where goods passed through, it was a place where the world met itself. Sometimes in the orderly appearance of trade, sometimes in the chaos of poverty and migration. For, along with goods, people also began to pour into Liverpool in greater numbers. Some came to work, some came to board ships, some came because they had nowhere else to go. A port city always has a particular pull for those standing at a crossroads. It can be a place of beginning, but it can also be a place of farewell. By the middle of the 19th century, Liverpool had become one of the great departure points for migrants traveling to America, Canada, Australia, and many other lands. Millions of people passed through this city on their journey out of Europe. They came from Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, from regions of Northern Europe and many other places. They carried wooden trunks, cloth bags, papers, letters of introduction, sometimes very little money. sometimes only a vague address somewhere across the ocean for them. Liverpool was not always the destination. Many stayed only a few days, a few weeks, or only long enough to wait for their ship. But in their memory, this city may have been the final image of Europe before the sea opened before them. Imagine an Irish family in those years, entering Liverpool after an exhausting journey. Light rain falls on the street. A child grips the mother's hand tightly. The father carries a worn bag. In their eyes, the city is both frightening and full of hope. Crowded streets, unfamiliar voices, the smell of coal smoke, people calling to one another near the docks. Far away, masts and dark hulls appear through the mist. They may not know much about Liverpool. They only know that from this place. A ship will carry them farther, to a land where there may be work, food, or at least a chance not to repeat the hardship they knew at home. The wave of Irish people left a particularly deep mark on Liverpool. After the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1840s, many people crossed the sea to this city. Some continued farther, while others stayed. Liverpool, therefore, was not only an English port looking toward Ireland. It gradually became a city carrying within itself part of the Irish soul. Neighborhoods grew more crowded. Poor families pressed into cramped houses. Churches, pubs, voices, songs, memories of home, all merged into local life. From then on, Liverpool's identity became more complex, no longer simply the story of an English seaport, but the story of a city formed by many crossings over water. But migration did not always carry the gentle color of hope. It also had the scent of anxiety, sickness, waiting, and overcrowding. People preparing to cross the Atlantic often faced immense uncertainty. They did not know what the ship would be like. They did not know how long the journey would last. They did not know whether they would survive the voyage without losing someone to illness, hunger, cold, or accident. On the dockside, between the sound of cargo and the whistle of ships, there were very small farewells. Someone embraced their mother for the last time. A child turned back to look at the shore. A man stood silently, trying to remember the smell of rain and the color of the sky in the place he was about to leave. Liverpool became a city of such moments, farewells not recorded in great books, footsteps that left no monuments, tears falling in the crowd and disappearing into the rain. But those moments are what deepen the history of the city. A port is not measured only by the number of ships or the amount of cargo. It is also measured by the number of people who once stood before the water, afraid and hopeful at the same time, knowing that when the ship left the dock, their lives would never return to what they had been. Meanwhile, the Liverpool of those who remained was also changing dramatically. The population grew, housing became cramped, and dock labor grew increasingly heavy. Beside beautiful buildings and modern docks lay the darker side of industrial life: pollution, disease, unstable work, poor children, and families living in hardship. The wealth of the port did not flow evenly into every home. There were people who watched goods from across the world pass through their hands, yet still had very little for dinner. This was one of the great contradictions of 19th century Liverpool. The more the city connected with the world, the more many ordinary people had to live in cramped and harsh neighborhoods. Behind the ships, warehouses, and railways were countless hands lifting, pulling, carrying, stacking, recording, and repairing. They were rarely remembered like merchants or engineers, but they were the quiet heartbeat of the city. The man returning home with aching shoulders after a day at the dock. The woman mending clothes by a small fire. The child sleeping amid the noise of the street. The young sailor who had just come ashore and did not yet know where he would go tomorrow. By the end of the 19th century, Liverpool had become a city of many layers. From a distance, it was a great port of the British Empire. From the waterfront, it was a forest of masts, chimneys, ropes, and warehouses. From the railway station, it was steam, movement, and goods connecting the sea with the factory. From the poorer streets, it was coal smoke, overcrowding, small hopes, and long exhaustion, and in the eyes of the migrant. Liverpool was the last doorway before the ocean. It was precisely this layering that made the city so alive. Liverpool was not only a symbol of trade, but a place where industry, empire, transport, migration, labor, poverty, and memory met beside the River Mersey. The railway brought the city more quickly into the interior. Albert Dock drew it more deeply into global commerce. Migrant crowds carried Liverpool into the memory of millions of families across the ocean. When evening fell over Albert Dock, the last light of day touched the red brick and the dark water. Warehouse doors closed. A train whistle sounded from the station, carrying a streak of smoke that dissolved into the sky. Down by the dock, a ship prepared to leave the Mersey. On board were goods, letters, workers, and families trying to look back at the city one last time. Liverpool was no longer small as it once had been, but it had never been truly at rest. It had grown through movement, and so it could almost never fully sleep. As the 19th century gradually came to an end, Liverpool had become one of the great port cities of the world. It had traveled very far from the image of a small medieval town. But the price of that growth still lay in every layer of brick, every warehouse, every poor neighborhood, and every story of migration. Liverpool had learned how to connect land with sea, factories with the ocean, Britain with empire, and those who departed with unknown horizons. And when night fell on the River Mersey, the ships lay still like long black shadows on the water. The city seemed tired, but not asleep. It knew that tomorrow morning goods would come again, ships would leave again, and another family might stand before the docks, looking toward the sea, wondering whether there truly was another life waiting for them across the ocean. Liverpool, in the age of railways, Albert Dock, and migration, had become a city built not only from stone and iron, but from journeys, farewells, and the quiet hope of human beings standing before the great sea. At Pier Head, the great buildings looked out over the river like sentinels made of stone. The Royal Liver Building, the Cunard Building, and the Port of Liverpool Building formed a confident skyline, as if the city wished to tell the world that Liverpool was not merely a place where ships came to dock, but a center of the sea, of commerce, and of the routes that connected Britain with distant oceans. By day, light touched the stone surfaces, the windows, and the solemn lines of the architecture. By evening, as darkness slowly settled over the River Mersey, Those massive forms stood motionless in the wind, carrying the calm dignity of a city that had passed through many centuries of change. But sometimes, history turns the very strength of a place into its weakness. Liverpool was important because of its port. That same port had once helped the city grow wealthy, connect with the world, receive goods, send people far away, and keep Britain linked to the outside. But when war came, a great port was not only a source of pride, it also became a target. The very things that had once brought life to the city now made the city visible from the sky as a place to be attacked. When the Second World War began in 1939, Liverpool could not stand aside. The city lay within Britain's vital transport network. Through the port of Liverpool, food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, and supplies could enter the country. In a war where the sea played a decisive role, a port like Liverpool did not merely serve commerce, it served survival itself. Ships crossed the Atlantic, facing submarines, weather, darkness, and fear, before finding their way back toward the Mersey when they reached the docks. The cargo unloaded from them was not only cargo, it was bread, coal, oil, steel, medicine, machinery, hope. The people of Liverpool could feel the war in many ways. War did not always enter everyday life with an explosion. Sometimes it began with curtains pulled tighter at night, with windows covered so that no light could escape, with the sound of air raid sirens during drills, with small conversations in queues for supplies, with children evacuated from the city, carrying small suitcases, name tags tied to their coats, and eyes that did not yet fully understand why they had to leave home, with mothers trying to appear calm as they packed bags for their children, though inside, their hearts were filled with worry. Liverpool in those days still worked. The port could not stop. If the port stopped, the country would weaken, and so, even when the sky became dangerous, laborers still went down to the docks. Porters still lifted cargo. Sailors still boarded ships. Railway workers still coordinated freight wagons. Women still worked in factories, offices, hospitals, shops, and homes. The city was no longer the peaceful trading port of the previous century. It had become a city at war, where ordinary life had to continue beneath a great shadow hanging overhead. Then the air raids began. Liverpool experienced its first air raid in August 1940, and in the months that followed. The city continued to be targeted many times. At first, perhaps each night of alarm still carried a sense of unreality. People heard the sirens, descended into shelters, waited in the darkness, and sometimes heard only the distant sound of aircraft fading away. But as time passed, that waiting no longer felt like a strange ritual. It became part of the night, part of the rhythm of life, part of memory. Imagine a Liverpool family on a winter night during the war. Dinner has long been finished. The small room is sealed against the light. On the table, a few cups remain, a cloth, and a small piece of bread left behind. The child is sleepy, but does not dare fall into deep sleep, because they know the siren may sound at any moment. The mother listens in silence. The father looks toward the covered window, though there is nothing to see beyond it but darkness. Then the siren begins. It stretches out, cold and sharp, like a sound cutting through the night. The whole family rises almost at once. No one says much. They already know what to do. Inside the shelter, time moves differently. There is no horizon, no river surface, no sky, only a narrow space, the breathing of many people, the smell of damp earth, wet coats, children whispering, someone praying very softly. People sit close together not because they know one another well, but because they share the same waiting for the night to pass, waiting for their roof to still be there, waiting for loved ones elsewhere to still be alive, waiting for morning to come without their familiar street having become something unrecognizable. For a port city, bombs did not only fall on civilian homes, they sought out docks, warehouses, railways, factories, the places that kept Britain's war machine functioning. Every explosion near the river could shake the water itself. Every fire in a warehouse could light the night sky with a fierce and painful brightness. Ships that had once rested quietly in the docks became fragile dark shapes between fire and smoke. Brick walls once built to keep cargo safe now had to endure the pressure of war from above. The May Blitz in early May 1941 was one of Liverpool's darkest moments during the Second World War, for many consecutive nights. Merseyside was bombed heavily, according to the Imperial War Museums. During the first 8 days of May 1941, around 1,900 people were killed. 1,450 were seriously injured, and around 70,000 people were made homeless. Those numbers are immense. But when we tell the story slowly, we understand that each number was a home, a name, an unfinished meal, an empty bed, a person who did not return. Nightfall over Liverpool in those days no longer resembled any night that had come before. The sky was no longer a quiet darkness above the city. It became a place people listened to with fear. The sound of aircraft might appear from far away. At first, only a low vibration in the air, then clearer, closer, heavier. After that came anti-aircraft fire, explosions, shattering glass, collapsing walls, voices calling through dust and smoke. But amid all those sounds, there were still very small human moments, one hand taking hold of another, a stranger making room for a child in a shelter, a rescue worker stepping into the ruins, though the danger had not yet passed. There were mornings after the air raids when the city woke into a strange silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after there had been too much sound. People stepped out of shelters, their eyes not yet used to the light. They looked around for familiar streets. Some places were still standing. Some had become only broken brick. A wall exposed the inside of a room like an open wound. A bed lay tilted in the dust. A broken cup rested on the floor. A staircase led upward to a place where there was no longer an upper floor. These small things sometimes hurt more than the larger images, because they showed how war had entered the most private parts of human life. Liverpool was bombed not only because it was a populous city, but because it was a strategic port. The areas around the docks and nearby places such as Bootle suffered especially severe damage. But bombs did not draw a clear line between military targets and civilian life. When a city is bombed from the sky, a strategic map turns into real houses, real streets, real families, A destroyed railway line may lie beside the place where children once played. A burning warehouse may redden the windows of a poor home. A bomb aimed at infrastructure may take away an entire row of houses. Even so, Liverpool did not stop functioning. This is important in the story of the city at war, not because the people were not afraid. They were afraid. Not because the city did not suffer. It suffered deeply, but the port still had to continue. Laborers returned when they could. Supply routes still had to be restored. Fires had to be extinguished. The wounded had to be carried away. Families who had lost their homes had to find temporary shelter. Children had to be cared for. Streets had to be cleared so that ambulances, fire engines, and transport vehicles could pass through. There was nothing glamorous in these tasks, but there was a very enduring kind of courage. Liverpool's courage in wartime did not lie only in great stories. It lay in a woman continuing to make tea for neighbors in a kitchen with cracked walls, in a child learning to sleep despite the sound of sirens, in rescuers digging with their hands through broken brick, in a sailor reaching the port, resting very little, then leaving again on another ship, in a dock worker seeing the place where he worked destroyed, then returning the next morning to see what could still be saved. War also changed the way the people of Liverpool looked at their city. Buildings that had once seemed familiar suddenly became fragile. Streets that had once felt ordinary became memories when they disappeared overnight. People began to understand that a city is not made only of brick and stone, but also of habits. A shop on the corner, a road to work, a church, a school, a bus stop, a fence, a wall where children once leaned their backs. When these things were broken, people lost more than material possessions. They lost part of the map inside their minds. And yet, in the darkest nights, the Mersey was still there. Perhaps its surface reflected fire. Perhaps smoke covered the sky above it. Perhaps ships anchored in the darkness waited for orders to move. But the river did not leave the city. It continued flowing toward the Irish Sea as it had flowed before Liverpool had a name. At a moment when everything human beings had built seemed as though it could be destroyed. That water became a strange image of continuation. Not an easy comfort, but a deeper rhythm, reminding us that the city had begun with water, and even in war, it still stood beside water. The war years gave Liverpool another layer of memory. Before that, the city already had the memory of trade, empire, migration, and dock labor. Now, it gained the memory of shelters, sleepless nights, shattered families, rescue workers, and streets deformed by bombs. Liverpool was no longer only a city of people going out to sea. It became a city of people staying under a dangerous sky, keeping the port, their families, and their community alive night after night. As the war gradually moved toward its final years, the people of Liverpool had become too familiar with loss to remain innocent, but not so familiar that they no longer felt pain. Every destroyed house, every person killed, every empty place in a family left a mark. There were wounds visible on brick walls, on streets, on vacant plots of land. There were wounds no one could see, lying in broken sleep, in fear at the sound of aircraft, in the memories of children who had grown up too soon. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Liverpool still stood beside the Mersey. But the city was no longer exactly as it had been before. It had survived. But survival did not mean the absence of loss. The docks, roads, neighborhoods, and families all carried the marks of the years of trial. People could breathe more easily when the sky was no longer a nightly threat. But the quiet after war had its own weight. Inside that quiet was a question. After everything that had been lost, how would the city continue? The answer did not come at once. It would require many years. But in this moment, as Liverpool's chapter of war slowly closes, we can imagine an evening after the war beside the River Mersey. The water is darker than the sky. A few ships lie still. The wind passes through walls that still carry scars. The city is tired, but still breathing. Those who remain walk through familiar streets that are no longer entirely familiar, carrying the memory of nights filled with sirens, shelters, flames in the sky, and names that cannot be forgotten. Liverpool during the war was not a story of simple glory. It was the story of a city important enough to be attacked, wounded deeply enough to be changed, and resilient enough to keep working amid the ruins. That great port city under the rain of bombs understood something earlier centuries had only suggested. Its position beside the River Mersey always brought opportunity, but it also always placed Liverpool before trials greater than itself. And when night falls, if we listen deeply enough, we might almost still hear the soft sound of water touching the shore. Beneath the distant echoes of war, that water does not erase sorrow, it simply continues. As the city continued, as ordinary people continued. And it was precisely in that continuation that Liverpool stepped out of the war, carrying its scars with it, into a new age that still did not know where it would carry the city next. After the war, Liverpool did not awaken into simple glory. The city had survived the bombs, but survival did not mean returning whole. The docks still lay beside the River Mersey. The great buildings still looked out over the water. The streets still had people going to work, children going to school, shops opening, and kitchen smoke rising into the cold morning air. But beneath that appearance of continuation, Liverpool carried a new exhaustion. The war had left gaps on the map of the city and in the hearts of its people. There were gaps even harder to fill. In the years after 1945, Britain entered a period of reconstruction in Liverpool. Reconstruction was not only about repairing walls, rebuilding streets, restoring the port and housing. It was also about learning how to live on after an age that had shaken old certainties. People returned from war, from the army, from evacuation, from long working shifts, and realized that the familiar city had changed. Places that had once been crowded were now empty ground. Streets had been reshaped. Some families no longer had enough people sitting around the dinner table. The Mersey still flowed, but the city on its banks had passed through a great wound. For a time, the port of Liverpool still remained important. Ships still docked, goods still passed through. Workers still went down to the waterfront early in the morning, hands cold in the wind, shoulders accustomed to the weight of heavy cargo. But the post-war world was changing in ways the old docks could not easily follow. The British Empire gradually weakened. Old trade routes shifted. Traditional industry lost its strength. Then, In the second half of the 20th century, containerization appeared, transforming the way goods were transported across the world. New ships needed deeper berths, different spaces, and more modern cargo handling systems. The docks that had once been Liverpool's pride began to feel inconvenient before a transport world that was coldly changing shape. Decline did not arrive like a single storm. It came slowly, but persistently. One job disappeared. One warehouse needed fewer workers. One family had someone unemployed for longer. One street had more closed windows. One evening, pubs spoke more often of better days gone by. Those who had once believed the port would feed the city forever began to feel that the ground beneath their feet was no longer as firm as before. Liverpool had grown through the movement of goods, railways, ships, and migrants. Now, as those currents changed direction, the city had to face a painful question. If the port was no longer the powerful heart it had once been, what would Liverpool become? In working-class districts, that question was not an economic concept. It was dinner. It was rent. It was a child's pair of shoes. It was the face of a father coming home earlier because there was no shift to work. It was a mother counting every coin in a small kitchen. It was a young man standing on a street corner, looking toward the docks without knowing whether there was still a place for him there. Industrial decline did not only make the city poorer, it wounded the pride of communities that had been built around labor, around skill, around the feeling that their hands were useful to a wider world. But Liverpool had never had only one voice. As the old port began to fade, another sound started rising from the city's streets. Clubs, basements, and music venues. It was not the whistle of ships, not the hammering on the docks, not the wheels carrying cargo. It was the sound of guitars, drums, and young voices, sometimes raw, sometimes mischievous, sometimes full of longing. In the 1950s and 1960s, amid a city still carrying the wound of war and beginning to feel the weight of decline, Liverpool became a place that produced a very special musical energy. The Beatles did not appear out of nowhere. They grew up in a port city where sounds from the outside world could arrive by many routes. Sailors, ships, cargo, records, stories from America and Europe, all helped create an atmosphere different from many inland cities. Liverpool heard the world before the world heard Liverpool. In small rooms, crowded clubs, hot, damp, smoke-filled basements, music was not only entertainment. It was a way for the young people of the city to say that they were still here, that they still wanted to go far, that they still had something to send out beyond the Mersey. Imagine a night on Matthew Street in the early 1960s. Outside, a thin rain falls onto the stone. Young people pass by in dark coats, wet hair, laughter mixed with footsteps. Down in the basement of the Cavern Club, the air is cramped, hot, and vibrating with sound. There is none of the glamour of a grand stage. No luxurious lights, only brick walls, human warmth, music striking close to the body, and the feeling that something is happening before anyone has found a name for it. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr would later become names known across the world. But before the world learned them by heart, they were Liverpool boys, emerging from a city that was both wounded and stubbornly alive. The Beatles carried Liverpool to the world by a route different from ships before. The city had been known for its port, its trade, its cargo, its empire, and its migrations. Now, the name Liverpool rang out on radios, on stages, on records, in the cheers of young people around the world. That had a deep meaning. A city that had once felt left behind by industrial change suddenly saw itself in a new cultural light. Not every problem disappeared. Poverty did not disappear because of a song. Unemployment did not dissolve because of a guitar. But music gave Liverpool something else, a gentle pride, a feeling that the city could still create something the world would listen to. At the same time, football continued to flow like a great emotional current through Liverpool life. Football here was not only about winning or losing, it was Saturday, a scarf, the walk to the ground, a father leading a child through familiar streets, the pub before the match, songs rising from the terraces, family memories passed down through generations. Liverpool had two great football colors, red and blue. Liverpool FC and Everton. In many families, love for football did not need to be explained. It was present in the voice, on the calendar, in stories at the table, in the joys and sorrows of every season. Everton already had a deep history within the city before Liverpool FC was born. Then, in 1892, Liverpool FC was officially founded after the split connected with Everton and Anfield. From that point on, football in Liverpool became inseparable from the city's identity. The two clubs were not only two teams, they were two communities of memory. Some people were born into blue. Some grew up in red. Some families divided that love in two and still sat at the same table. There were fierce but familiar arguments, because beneath the rivalry was still the same city, the same voice, the same rainy sky, and the same River Mersey lying quietly in the distance. In the post-war years, the football ground became a place where people could feel that the city still had strength. When life outside was difficult, when work was uncertain, when the port was weakening, when many neighborhoods were under the pressure of poverty, matches gave people another rhythm. A week could be long and tiring, but when the ball began to move, people entered a space where singing warmed the body, where thousands looked in the same direction, breathed with the same passage of play, and rose together in a single moment. Football could not heal all of Liverpool's wounds, but it gave the city a way to feel that it was still a community. And from this very mixture of labor, music, football, poverty, humor, and pride, the Scouse spirit became clearer than ever. Scouse is not only the name of an accent or a dish associated with Liverpool, it is a sense of belonging, a way of speaking that is quick, sharp, warm, sometimes teasing, sometimes very tender, a kind of humor that helps people get through heavy days. A slightly defiant pride among those who know their city is often viewed from the outside through prejudice, yet still do not need anyone's permission to love where they live. The Scouse spirit is not easy optimism. It does not say that everything is fine. On the contrary, it was born partly because everything was not fine, from the feeling of being abandoned by centers of power farther away, from the experience of poverty, from the memory of Irish migration, from port life, where people were used to strangers, to news from far away, to the uncertainty of ships and work, from neighborhoods where people could tease one another very directly, but also stand beside one another in hardship. Scouse is laughter in difficulty, sharpness as self-defense, loyalty to community, the way a city says, we know who we are, whether others understand us or not. But Chapter 6 of Liverpool cannot contain only music and football. By the end of the 20th century, the city also carried within it a very great sorrow. On April 15, 1989, the Hillsborough disaster occurred during the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. 97 Liverpool supporters ultimately lost their lives because of that disaster. This is not a detail to create drama. It is a memory that must be told in a low and respectful voice, because it touches families, justice, communal grief, and the long struggle of those who remained. Hillsborough was not only the tragedy of a football club. For Liverpool, it became a wound of the city. Those who died that day were not numbers in football history. They were sons, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, friends, people who had gone to watch a match and did not return. Afterward came many years in which the families of the victims and the survivors had to fight for the truth to be recognized in Liverpool's story. This says much about the spirit of community. Grief was not left in silence. Memory was not handed over for outsiders to define. And love of football in this city has always been tied to human dignity. If Chapter 5 showed Liverpool under bombs, then Chapter 6 shows another kind of trial, the trial of peacetime. There were no nightly air raid sirens, but there was economic decline. There was no fire of war over the docks, but there were jobs disappearing. There were no new ruins from bombs, but there were tired neighborhoods, worried families, young people asking where their future might be. And in the middle of all this, the city did not answer with a single voice. It answered with music, with football, with Scouse laughter, with anger when anger was needed, with loyalty to one another, with the act of continuing to sing even when life was not easy. Picture Liverpool on an evening at the end of the 20th century. On one street, someone is talking about the work that has been lost. In another house, the radio plays a Beatles song again, making an older person remember younger years, when the city suddenly became the center of the music world. Near the football ground, supporters pass by in coats and scarves, their footsteps mingling with the rain. In a small pub, someone tells an old story in a very quick Scouse accent. The whole table laughs, then falls silent for a moment when those who are no longer here are mentioned. That city is not gentle in a simple sense. It softens only when we look long enough to see that beneath the noise lies a very deep affection. Post-war Liverpool was a city that had lost many things, but also found new ways to survive. When the port no longer held the position it once had, the city did not disappear. When industry weakened, its voice still rang out. When outsiders looked at Liverpool through poverty, crisis, or prejudice, the people here still held on to their pride, not a polished pride, but the pride of those who had endured many storms and still had enough strength to joke, sing, cheer, remember, and love their city. The Beatles, football, and the Scouse spirit. therefore, are not decorative pieces added to Liverpool's history. They are the city's answers to a difficult age. The Beatles gave Liverpool a sound that traveled out into the world when the old ships no longer did so as they once had. Football gave people a place to gather, to sing, to suffer together, and rejoice together. The Scouse spirit gave the city its own voice, a way to stand upright through decades of wounds. Together, they created a post-war Liverpool that was sad and alive, rough and full of feeling. And when night falls over the River Mersey, we can imagine that city lying between two memories. Behind it are the whistles of ships, the distant echoes of bombs, the fading sound of the industrial port. Ahead are guitars, terraces, people talking in the rain, and a city telling its own story in a voice unlike anywhere else. The ships may still lie motionless on the water. The old docks may be quieter than before. But Liverpool is not silent. It has found new sounds. After the weary decades of the post-war years, Liverpool entered the modern age not like a city allowed to forget its past. The city could not simply turn its back on the old docks, on the silent warehouses, on the streets that had once lived by the sound of ships, of cargo, of workers' footsteps heading down to the waterfront in the early morning. What had been lost still remained there, in the red brick, in the water, in the abandoned stretches of land left behind after the industrial age. But alongside that loss, something else began to take shape. The idea that Liverpool could tell its own story again, not by erasing the past, not by casting a new light over the old docks and pretending nothing had ever hurt, but by transforming the places that had once served trade, empire, labor, and migration into spaces of memory, culture, art, and public life. This is what makes modern Liverpool so distinctive. The city did not revive through a miracle. It revived by turning back toward the oldest parts of itself and asking, what can these walls still say to people today? For many years, Albert Dock was no longer the shining image of 19th century commerce. At one point, it was filled with silt, deserted, forgotten, no longer carrying the industrial rhythm that had once made it a symbol of Liverpool. The red brick warehouses that had witnessed goods from across the world passing through now stood motionless beside the water, like tired giants after an age had ended. The water inside the dock no longer reflected forests of masts and busy trade as it once had. It reflected silence, decline, and a difficult question: what becomes of a structure born for commerce when the world of commerce has left it behind? But from that very silence, another possibility opened. From the 1980s onward, Albert Dock began to be redeveloped, becoming one of the clearest symbols of Liverpool's waterfront revival. The old buildings were restored. The water was brought back to life. Spaces once used to store goods gradually became museums, galleries, restaurants, cafes, walkways, and destinations for visitors. A place that had once played a role in the commercial network of empire became a place where people came to look back at history, listen to music, see art, sit beside the water, and experience the city in a slower way. Imagine a modern afternoon at Royal Albert Dock. The wind still blows in from the Mersey, but the sounds are different now. There is no longer the noise of chains dragging heavy cargo, or the voices of porters rising through the morning mist. Instead, there are footsteps of visitors on the paved walkways, quiet conversations beside cafe doors, the sound of cameras, children laughing, water touching softly against the dock walls. The red brick warehouses still stand there, with the same shape, the same material, the same heavy 19th century memory. But inside them, the meaning has changed. A city may not be able to change its past, but it can change the way that past is opened to those who come after. In modern Liverpool, the waterfront is no longer only a workplace for cargo ships. It has become a space for walking, looking, remembering, consuming, learning, and taking pride. Residents and visitors can pass along the same waterways where imperial goods once moved, then step into museums that tell stories of the sea, migration, slavery, art, and music. This creates a very particular feeling. Liverpool does not hide its historical layers behind its back. The city places them right beside the water, where the wind passes through, where people can come close, where memory does not sit dryly in books, but appears in brick, iron, stone, photographs, objects, and human stories. But urban revival is never simple. When an old city begins to develop again, it must always face the question, how can it move toward the future without breaking the very thing that gives it a soul? Liverpool wants new jobs, new housing, new commercial spaces, and a new image. But Liverpool also carries a very deep physical heritage. The docks, warehouses, riverside buildings, and historic landscapes are not merely backdrops for tourist photographs. They are evidence of an age that shaped the city and the world. And so, every new project, every new building, every change along the waterfront raises a fragile balance between development and preservation. That tension became clearer when Liverpool was once placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2004 under the name Liverpool Maritime Mercantile City, recognizing the city's historic role as an important maritime trading port. But in 2021, UNESCO decided to remove that title, stating that the attributes expressing the outstanding universal value of the heritage area had been seriously affected by urban development. It was a sad moment, and also a deeply thought-provoking one in the history of modern Liverpool. Because losing the UNESCO title was not only an administrative matter, it was like a mirror held up before the city. In that mirror, Liverpool saw a question many historic cities around the world are also facing. Can memory live alongside development? A city may need housing, jobs, investment, modern spaces, and new symbols. But if the physical layers of the past are changed too much, can the city still preserve its ability to tell its own story through its urban body? Liverpool is not the only place struggling with this question, but because its port history is so deep, the question becomes especially sensitive here. Even so, the modern story of Liverpool cannot be told only through loss. If the 20th century once caused the city to be seen through the lens of decline, recent decades have also seen Liverpool reposition itself through culture. In 2008, Liverpool became the European capital of culture, an important milestone that helped the city step onto the European stage with a different image. It was no longer only an old port, a weary industrial city, or the hometown of a famous band. Liverpool appeared as a place of art, theater, festivals, museums, music, architecture, heritage, and community vitality. Culture. Liverpool described 2008 as a moment that changed perceptions of the city, placing Liverpool on a broader cultural stage. Imagine Liverpool in that year, not through the noise of triumph, but through the feeling of a city being seen again. The squares were brighter. Performances drew residents and visitors. Old buildings became backdrops for contemporary art. People moved through the city center with a different feeling, that this place did not only have history to commemorate, but also a present to live. For many post-industrial cities, culture is not a luxury. It is a way to heal an image, create work, attract young people, and make residents believe that the story of where they live is still continuing. Music continues to be a very deep part of that process. In 2015, Liverpool was added to the UNESCO Creative Cities Network with the title City of Music. UNESCO recognized Liverpool as a city where music lies at the heart of cultural identity and plays a role in post-industrial recovery. This fits the history of the city very well. From the cellars of the Cavern Club to larger stages, from Mersey Beat to new artists. Liverpool does not live only on the memory of the Beatles. It continues to create sound, performance spaces, festivals, creative communities, and a very particular understanding of how music can help a city recognize itself. In modern Liverpool, music is no longer only a legacy of the 1960s. It has become a current flowing through generations. Visitors come because of the Beatles, but then they encounter a wider city, small music venues, young artists, festivals, universities, cultural programs, and a nightlife that still carries its own tone. Like the River Mersey, music in Liverpool does not stand still. It flows through the past, touches the present, and continues moving towards sounds that have not yet been written. Football, too, remains one of the great languages of modern Liverpool. The city continues to share its emotional life through Anfield and Goodison Park, through red and blue, through match days when the streets change rhythm. Pubs fill more quickly, songs rise louder, and families live again with a joy and sorrow that feel deeply familiar. But in this modern chapter, football does not need to be told as a list of achievements. What matters more is that it still holds a communal function. In a city that has passed through decline, revival, conflict, and loss, the football ground remains a place where people gather to feel they belong to something larger than themselves. If we walk through Liverpool today, we will see that the city no longer carries a single face. Along the waterfront, old and new buildings stand beside one another, sometimes in harmony, sometimes arguing through their very shapes. At Albert Dock, 19th century red brick reflects on the water beside modern signs. At Pier Head, historic buildings still look out toward the Mersey, while around them are public spaces, visitors, events, and new urban rhythms. In other neighborhoods, there are still traces of inequality, questions about housing, work, opportunity, and who truly benefits from revival. A reborn city does not mean every wound has healed. It means only that the city is still trying. This is what makes modern Liverpool feel more real. It is not a fairy tale about an old port transformed into a shiny tourist destination. It is the story of a place trying to transform its past without fully escaping the tensions of that past. Maritime and slavery museums remind us that Liverpool's wealth cannot be separated from the painful chapters of the Atlantic. Music tours remind us that culture can be born from ordinary streets, ordinary young people, and small rooms. The roads around the docks remind us that development can bring vitality, but it can also alter the face of memory if not handled with enough care. On a quieter evening, when the city lights begin to reflect on the water, modern Liverpool can look very gentle. People walk slowly along the waterfront. The wind moves through coats. A seabird cries overhead. Light from cafes spills onto the walkway. The water inside the dock darkens, holding within it the image of red brick, modern glass, and a sky turning color. It is a beautiful scene, but not an empty beauty. It is beautiful because time lies beneath it. Beautiful because that same water once reflected merchant ships, cargo, migrants, bombs, abandonment, and now the slow footsteps of modern people. Liverpool revived by bringing the water back to the center of life. Long ago, water was the road of commerce. Later, water became the memory of industry left behind. Now, water has become a space where the city can look at itself. People come to the riverbank not only to work, but to walk, to learn history, to listen to music, to take photographs, to meet one another, to feel that they are in a place with depth. The River Mersey, therefore, remains the main thread of the story. From the first chapter to the final one, it has never disappeared. Only its role has changed along with the city. Perhaps the most valuable thing about modern Liverpool is that it does not try to become an entirely new place. It cannot. And perhaps it should not. This city has too many memories to be rewritten from a blank page. Instead, Liverpool is like an old book with a new chapter opened inside it. The first pages contain mud, water, and a small town. Later pages contain the old dock, trade, slavery, empire, migration, war, the Beatles, football, decline, and the Scouse spirit. The modern chapter does not tear those pages away. It adds museums, festivals, new music, tourism, urban debate, pedestrian bridges, glass buildings, and afternoons when residents return to the water. But a city that remembers must also know how to question itself. Who is included in the story of revival? Who is pushed aside when land becomes more expensive? Which heritage is preserved? And which heritage is changed? When an old port district becomes a tourist destination, can the memory of laboring people still be heard? When the city becomes more attractive to visitors, do ordinary residents still feel they are at the center of that place? These questions do not weaken Liverpool. They make Liverpool's story more mature, because every true revival must accept a conversation with what remains imperfect. And perhaps that is how Liverpool should be understood today, not as a city that has completed its journey, but as a city still negotiating with time. It negotiates between preservation and development, between tourism and local life, between painful memory and cultural pride, between old buildings and new lines, between the songs of the past and the sounds of a generation not yet known. Modern Liverpool does not stand still beside the Mersey to gaze at itself in the past. It moves forward. But every step echoes on the stones of what has already happened. As the final chapter of this journey draws near its resting point, imagine yourself standing on the waterfront at night. Behind you is the city with its lights, cafes, museums, hotels, railway stations, football grounds, and rain-damp streets. Before you is the dark and wide River Mersey. On one side, historic buildings still hold their solemn shape. On the other, the glass and steel of the modern age reflect new light. On the water, past and present lie side by side, not fully dissolved into each other, but not separate either. If we listen closely, we can hear many Liverpools at once. The Liverpool of mud and tide, the Liverpool of a medieval town looking toward the sea, the Liverpool of the old dock and the shadow of the Atlantic, the Liverpool of railways, Albert Dock, and migrants leaving their homelands, the Liverpool of bombs and shelters, the Liverpool of the Beatles, football, and the Scouse voice, and modern Liverpool, where people still walk beside the water, still debate the future, still sing, still remember, still try to turn scars into part of identity rather than hide them away. This city has changed shape many times, but it has never completely lost the first thing that made it what it was, a deep relationship with water. Liverpool was born beside the Mersey, grew because of the Mersey, suffered because of what passed through the Mersey, and revived by returning to the Mersey. The river does not explain everything, but it holds the chapters of the city together like a dark, soft, enduring thread. And when night falls, modern Liverpool is no longer the small town before 1207, nor the imperial port of the 19th century, nor only the post-war city of decline and music. It is all of those things at once, a city built from water, brick, iron, songs, memory, loss, and hope. A city that once sent millions of people out to sea, endured bombs, was left behind, sang loudly, fought to be recognized rightly, and still continues to stand beside the Mersey as though listening to the rhythm of the water calling it onward. Liverpool did not revive because it forgot the past. It revived because it learned how to live with the past. And perhaps that is what allows this city to remain in memory longer than a beautiful view. It does not only show us an illuminated waterfront, a restored dock, or a celebrated culture. It shows us how a place once made heavy by history can still find a new voice, if it is brave enough to look back, gentle enough to change, and loyal enough not to lose its soul. And beneath it all, the River Mersey still flows, slowly, coldly, widely, quietly moving out toward the Irish Sea, as it flowed before Liverpool had a name, as it flowed through the days when the city grew wealthy, the nights when the city burned bright, the years when the city fell silent, and the afternoons when the city began to revive. That water does not keep everything, but it remembers in the way water remembers, through movement, through reflection, through continuation. And Liverpool, the city of water, memory, and rebirth, still continues its story beside that current. And here, our journey tonight through the entire history of Liverpool slowly comes to a close. From a small waterfront beside the River Mersey, we have traveled through more than 800 years of memory. We have seen Liverpool when it was still a modest town, quietly turning its face toward the sea. We have stepped into the docks where water was held behind stone walls, where the old dock opened a new age of commerce, and where the city's wealth was always bound to the deep shadows of the Atlantic. Empire and slavery. We have also stood in the heart of Albert Dock, listening to the sound of wheels, ropes, cargo, and migrants preparing to leave Europe for an unknown future. We have passed through the nights of war, when the sky above Liverpool burned with bombs, then moved into the post-war years, when the old port began to fade. Yet the city found its voice again in music, in football, in the Scouse accent, and in the very particular pride of people who were never easily defeated. If you enjoy calm historical journeys like this, please subscribe to the channel and follow the fan page, so we can continue traveling together through other cities, kingdoms, civilizations, and ancient mysteries. And before you leave, please write a comment. What story would you like to hear next? An ancient city, a lost empire, a king, a seaport, or a civilization that once slept quietly inside time. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. I wish you a peaceful night, and I will see you again in the next story.